Hello, and welcome back to World Civilization 2. We are finishing up just a little section on Mary Wollstonecraft. She was a philosopher during the Age of Enlightenment, and she was a woman, and she is really the foundation, considered the foundation of the feminist movement, which really, and we'll talk more about this when we do our history analysis word, feminism doesn't mean that you hate men. It just means they're asking for equality. And you'll really see that in her work. And, that's another reason, we talked about ignorance and not knowing what the word feminism truly means. It does not mean a hatred of men in any way, shape, or form. There can be people who are militant feminists, but that's not really the trend, and that's often portrayed in a bad light. So we are going to finish chapter 29. And I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and show you a picture of her. Here is Mary Wollstonecraft. And we're going to talk about her a little bit. She really just supported the notion of equality of the sexes in general ways. There was a lot of thought about what made woman a woman, and that she was hysterical nonstop, and she couldn't be alone, or she would be hysterical. Just a lot of false statements that were out there during this period. She really took a public stance on the behalf of her sex, and she was an English intellectual and writer. If you look on page 403, there's a lot on her life. She had an abusive father. Her sister, she saved her from a marriage that was abusive and hid her until she was safe. And then the two of them started a all-female school. In 1788, she became a regular contributor of articles in a journal of analytical reviews. She accused society of breeding and educating women to be helpless, gentle domestic brutes. When you begin reading about really what was happening in society, it's almost like your logic and emotions are almost like muscles. And if you feed your logical side, well, then you'll be very logical. And if you starve your emotional side, then you won't be emotional. And if you feed your emotional side, you'll be overly emotional maybe, or you could be overly logical if you only feed one or the other. And then if you don't feed that logical portion of your brain, there isn't balance. And I think she was really talking about women really needed to see that they had abilities to better themselves and improve their self-worth. Let's see, what else did she say? She said, contemporary society considered women to be foolish and devoid of serious thought, like they couldn't do it. And that was just not true. Also, she actually advocated something that was really not talked about. Women had strong sexual needs, and that denying them the chance of sexual fulfillment helped to dehumanize them. And in history, when you hear the word dehumanized, when one paradigm is an us and a them paradigm, like those people over there and we're over here, and not realizing that they're both humanity. It's humanity. All of them are humanity. When we dehumanize a certain sect of people, whether it's religion, race, or gender, that's when real abuses take place in history. She did marry a man, an American, Gilbert Imlay, and she had a baby with him and moved to France. And then he actually abandoned her, and she was left with a baby. Then she came back to England, and she met what they call her free-thinking soulmate, and his name was Godwin. His name was William Godwin. And then they didn't want to get married because they felt that it was like a social despotism. But then when she was going to have a baby, they went ahead and got married because they didn't want their daughter to live under the stigma of being illegitimate. What's really sad is that 2 weeks after her second daughter was born, she died. But what's really interesting is that her daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, married a romantic poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. And Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, she wrote a book that you might have heard of called Frankenstein. So she is famous for writing this document called The Vindication of Women, Women's Rights. Let me see. I was going to pull it up. There we go. And just read a few excerpts from it. A vindication of the rights of women, a vindication of the rights of woman with strictures on political and moral subjects. Okay, the most perfect education, in my opinion, is such an exercise of the understanding as is best calculated to strengthen the body and form the heart. Or, in other words, to enable the individual to attain such habits of virtue as will render it independent. So, you know, getting away from this notion of women being dependent on man and not being able to survive, which is very Victorian. And we'll see in The Cult of True Womanhood when we read that as well. In fact, it is a farce to call any being virtuous whose virtues do not result from the exercise of its own reason. This was Rousseau's opinion respecting men. I extend it to women, and confidently assert they have been drawn out of their sphere of false refinement, and not by an endeavor to acquire masculine qualities. Still the regal homage which they receive is so intoxicating that till the manners of times are changed and formed on more reasonable principles, may be impossible to convince them that the illegitimate power which they obtain by degrading themselves is a curse, and they must return to nature of equality, if they wish to secure the placid satisfaction that unsophisticated affections impart. But for this epoch we must wait perhaps till kings and nobles, enlightened by reason and preferring the real dignity of man, a childish state, throw off their gaudy hereditary trappings, and if then women do not resign the arbitrary power of beauty, they will prove that they have less mind than man. I was trying to find another. All right, here's another one. She did have strong language. I lament that women are systematically degraded by receiving the trivial attentions which men think it mainly to pay to the sex, when in fact they are insultingly supporting their own superiority. It is not condescension to bow to an inferior. So ludicrous, in fact, do these ceremonies appear to me, that I scarcely am able to govern my muscles. When I see a man start with eager and serious solicitude to lift a handkerchief or shut a door, when the lady could have done it herself, had she only moved a pace or two. So she's saying, just being independent, not acting like you can't open a door, which in the Victorian era, with your extremely tight clothing and dresses, women were actually weak. They were considered weak because they were wearing such tight bodices. Okay, so that concludes chapter 29. We just wanted to end with one of the, most famous women who really just said women and men are equal, and that was Mary Wollstonecraft. Thank you. Make sure you study for your quiz.